So thank you all very much for coming back after the break for this next session. So 6 months ago, I was at a dinner party in London, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who it turns out was an ex-special forces officer in the British military, which I thought was kind of cool. So we started chatting. I said, well, what do you do now? He said, well, I'm an executive coach now. I said, wow, an executive coach. How do you go from being special forces to coaching executives? He goes, it's basically the same thing. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, the advice they teach you in the military is surprisingly useful for life at a modern corporation. So that's kind of cool. So I said, all right, well, share with me some, I'm figuring maybe I'll get some free information like you do with doctors at parties. What would be the one thing, the most common advice you find yourself giving executives? And he said, well, typically the one thing that I find myself teaching everyone is this notion of commander's intent. That's one of the most kind of commonly misunderstood and most useful terms. And I'm like, commander's intent? What's that? And he said, well, there's this book called The Art of Action. If there's one book you should go out and get yourself to read, it's The Art of Action. I said, that sounds kind of cool. So I went out, I bought the book, and it is extremely useful. And so today's talk is largely based on a lot of information from this book, as well as my own kind of experience putting it into practice and other kind of follow-ups I've done since then. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is common sense, but that's fine. A lot of good advice in business is common sense that people typically don't apply. So what's commander's intent? Well, it all starts with this guy, Karl von Clausewitz, a famous Prussian general. How many people here have ever tried to actually read on war? Anyone actually tried to read it? It's a very difficult book to read. It is. I got, I think, 5 pages into it and I quit. And I actually like military histories. So it's slow going. But this guy is still credited as being one of the best modern theorists of warfare. You know, this is still in the top 10 list of books recommended for reading at West Point. One of the key concepts he introduces is this notion of fog of war. And of course, we're all gamers. We all know what fog of war is, right? This is fog of war, the idea that you can't see the whole battlefield at any given time. That's pretty simplistic. You know, this is really what he means by fog of war, this concept that, you know, war is chaotic. There's unexpected developments happening all the time. And you have, especially because of the stresses and fear of war, you have not just incomplete information, but often erroneous information, rumors, you know, fear, doubt, uncertainty. It's a mess. And so he actually makes a whole list. There's a whole chapter just called friction. He calls it friction. Friction to him is this notion of all the things that make it hard in war to get your orders carried out. Because as a general, of course, you have a perfect idea of what has to happen, but then between you as the general trying to give orders and the orders actually being carried out, there's this massive gap. And that gap is what he calls friction. And so he says there's a few different sources of friction. Sources like imperfect information. You don't actually know what's really going on out there because war is messy. You do know what's going on, and you try to transmit information, and it doesn't get through correctly. And that could be because people mess up your orders, because people are stressed out. You know, the person carrying your order gets shot, perhaps. You know, so information doesn't get through. And finally, there's external factors. The weather. You know, the famous, you know, Napoleon entering Russia, and it got really cold, and you know, the army of attrition. So things happen. That's the notion of friction. The reason we're here today, of course, is we're not just talking about the battlefield, we're also talking about the workplace. And if you think about friction in a workplace, it's every bit as chaotic sometimes in a workplace. And once again, as the CEO or the executive, you often know what has to happen. And yet there's friction. There's friction because people are messy. People have emotions. You know, we did the last session we just we're sitting in talked all about the fact that to really get the best out of your people, you have to engage with them as human beings because there are emotions and pride and all sorts of factors. The workplace is complex. You're dealing with a lot of other companies out there doing things at the same time you are. That makes things complicated. And finally, the environment's always complicated. So that's friction in a workplace. If you take friction to its logical conclusion, then you end up with this famous quote by another Prussian general who came after Clausewitz called Helmuth von Moltke, now known as the Elder, to keep him separate from his nephew, the Younger, who has a famous quote, "No battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy." Right? The idea that in a world of friction, you can have the best plans in the world, but the minute you actually try to carry them out, things change. Things start getting confused, and plans no longer necessarily apply. I think in some ways this is better even said by a more recent general, perhaps, Mike Tyson. Everybody's got a plan until I hit them. Right, and that's often what it feels like at work. So what do you do about this? So what what do we do next? This is where commander's intent comes in, and this is frankly where the book comes in, and this is how it applies to us. If you think about any business, there's basically three elements that we're dealing with. We're dealing with plans. We're dealing with the actions that our organizations or our teams or our companies take to actually carry out those plans. And then, of course, you've got the outcomes from those plans. And it's a little loop because, of course, depending on what happens, the outcomes affects what you do for your next plans and so forth. It's a cycle. So when you can factor in friction and fog of war and so forth, you end up with these gaps. And there's a gap between each of these factors. If there was no friction and you had a perfect world, it would be like a superconductor. I mean, your business would just hum along at 1,000 miles an hour because there'd be absolutely nothing blocking perfect execution. And sometimes people joke about you have this most perfect PowerPoint presentation, and you're like, I wish I could just compile my PowerPoint presentation and ship it, right? Because that would be perfect, because it exists in this perfect platonic ideal in PowerPoint. I just want to ship that thing. But of course, that's not how it works. You've got the messiness of friction. So there are these gaps. The first gap is the notion of the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap lives in that space between the outcomes, the real world, and your plans. And it talks about this difference between what you want to know and what you actually know, right? Like, I would love to know exactly what my competitors are doing right now, but I can't. I would love to know exactly what the sales are of the next Apple TV device, which Apple's going to announce next week, a year in advance. But I can't, because that's reality. There's a next gap is this notion of the alignment gap. The alignment gap goes more toward your own organization. The difference between what you want someone to do and what they actually do, right? And I would love my team to, I've got this idea for a PowerPoint that I'm asking someone to make for me. I hand it off. What comes back a week later bears no resemblance at all to what I had in my head. That's the alignment gap. And then there's the next gap is the effects gap. And the effects gap is the difference between what you expect your actions to achieve and what they actually achieve. So you might expect that if my team goes off and works really hard for the next 6 months, we'll ship a game at the end of it and we'll make all this money. And you work really hard and you spend 6 months and you ship the product and it flops. You sell 10 units. Yeah, that's the effects gap. So you have these gaps. So what do you do about these gaps? And I'm sure, raise your hand, we've all felt these, right? We've all been in positions where we felt these gaps. So what do you do about it? Well, the common reaction is to basically become a tyrannical micromanager, right? To basically say, well, we're going to fix these gaps by clenching down and trying to control even closer. So the knowledge gap is a classic one. There's this gap of knowledge. I'm going to ask for more information. I'm going to ask my direct reports to come in and every single day give me an update on exactly what they're doing because I've got this knowledge gap. And in warfare, this would be the example of like the general sitting far away from the front who's constantly asking his soldiers to come and check in and tell them exactly what's going on, to the point where half their resources are used ferrying information back and forth instead of actually fighting the war. The alignment gap. If people are not doing what you think they're going to do, you're going to give even more detailed instructions. You're going to micromanage them even closer because obviously it's not working. They're not doing what you want, so you're going to try even harder to tell them exactly what to do. That obviously doesn't work. And then you've got the effects gap, right? And so, if the actions you're taking aren't getting the desired results, the answer, of course, is even more controls. If your organization is spending too much money, you're going to restrict even tighter what it takes to get anything done. And of course, the result of all this is not what you expect in success. It results in an even more dysfunctional organization because if people are basically if the answer is trying to narrow down the instructions, people are basically going to stop doing anything because the reality will never, the whole point of the fog of war and friction is that reality will never match the plan. It just never will. And so if people are being told, don't do something unless it matches the plan, they'll ultimately just become paralyzed and nothing will ever happen. So if this is not the answer, what is the answer? And this is basically the part that's common sense. So the answer, as explained in the book and Commander's Intent, is this notion of what they call directed opportunism. The basic idea is, since you, the commander, the general, the executive, the CEO, the studio head, the executive producer, since you cannot ever have perfect information, and no one can ever have perfect information, and there's this thing called friction, what you have to do is push decision-making and push the decision-making actions as close to the front as possible. So that the people actually making the decisions are the ones who are directly doing the work, and reduce the opportunity for these gaps, shrink the gaps by pushing decision-making as close to the work itself as possible. And by doing that, you're basically reducing the opportunity for friction to slip in because you're getting the actual decisions closer to the work. Makes total sense. So what that basically means is, instead of telling people, this is the common sense part, instead of telling people exactly what to do, the how, you instead tell them the why you need them to do something, and the intent, hence the commander's intent, the intent of what you want, the outcome. Our studio is running out of money. We will go bankrupt in a year if we don't have hit on hands. That's the why. My intent is for you to ship a title that will make us, enough revenue to cover our loss. That would be the intent. That would be the outcome. Now, how do you actually do that? Of course, that's the hard part, and that's the part that what this is basically saying is you push it out to the people who are actually going to be doing the work itself. So in this case, you shrink the knowledge gap by, instead of demanding all the perfect information, you simply limit your knowledge flow to defining the intent to the next level down. The alignment gap, instead of trying to micromanage and give people perfect instructions, you allow yourself, you let each level figure out for themselves how they're going to actually accomplish the intent. And the effects gap you solve by letting the people who are actually doing the work adjust their actions accordingly, as long as their adjustments are in line with whatever that intent was. So this is, of course, been codified in the military. Ever since von Moltke came up with this back in the 1800s, the military has been taking this over 100 plus years now, successfully refining it to the point where, if you look at the Army Operations Manual, and frankly all the military forces have some variant of this now, it's actually codified as commander's intent. The idea, so this is the complicated version, you can summarize it as, you, the boss, or the commander, have to decide what really matters. What's the most important thing that actually has to happen? And that, frankly, is hard itself, but you got to figure that out. Once you figure that out, step 2, communicate that to your people, and then basically get out of the way, essentially. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the practical reality of how do you actually do that, and then we'll actually have a workshop exercise where we'll actually do some of this ourselves in real time. So an important point, by the way, is that communication part. That part 2, get the message across. That's kind of the hardest part. I mean, figuring out is hard, and then getting it across is hard. And if your people don't understand the message, if they don't understand the intent, it's not their fault, it's your fault. And a big part of military training, believe it or not, is learning how to give orders. In fact, if you're trained to be a general or an officer, a big part of your training is learning how to essentially draft an orders, because they have to be short and sweet, but you have to give just enough information, but not too much information. And that's actually the challenging part. And people in business do this all the time. I'm notorious for being too verbose, and I'm talking, and I'm like, just tell me what you want me to do, James. Like sometimes you can get that lost. So let's first talk about that first part, deciding what really matters. That's basically strategy, right? Your corporate strategy, your business strategy is figuring out what really matters. And so, I'm not get into today an entire session on how do you pick your strategy for your company. Ideally, you should know what needs to get done. One thing you can think about in terms of this is you can think about 3 pieces. You can think about the aims of your business. Do we want to do this thing? Does it align with what our business is supposed to be doing? The opportunities, can we actually do this thing? It may be that this opportunity doesn't even exist. And finally, capabilities. Can our organization actually accomplish this? If you find something that, and this is the heart of competitive advantage, your organization's competitive advantage lives in that intersection of things you want to do, things you can do, and things you have the opportunity to do. And if you can pull that off, you've got a sustainable competitive advantage. So once you've figured out what it is you need to accomplish, the next step then is actually getting it across, and that's the briefing part. And the briefing is about what you want to achieve, the goals, why it matters, that's the context. And then you give your people the freedom to choose for themselves what they're actually going to do, like the tactics, how they're actually going to carry it out, and how they're going to realize that intent. So that's kind of the briefing. There's this hidden part to it, though, which people don't often think of. This is still common sense. I'm sure we all kind of get this. This is about classic 101, don't micromanage. The part that's often left out is what they call the back briefing. And the back briefing is where, after you've given someone their orders, they go away, they come up with their plan, and then they actually feed it back to you and say, okay, boss, thanks for I understand what my mission is. Here's how I'm going to do it. Is that right? And that's a chance for you to check both that they actually got the message and that they've got a reasonable plan of how they're going to carry it out. And what's cool about this, what I'm showing here is this is a typical multi-level studio, or this is a multiple level organization. If your team is like a 4-person indie team, this is frankly not so hard. Where this really starts to get more complicated is when you have these multiple level organizations. And obviously the military is nothing but hierarchy. I mean, if in typical military, you might have 8 to 10 levels between the general all the way down to the person in the front lines. And so, which is not frankly that different from a big organization. Oftentimes you'll have your studio boss, you'll have your executive producers, you'll have your tech leads, you'll have your managing engineers, and so on down the line. So what's interesting here is that I'm, let's say, the boss. I have my intent. I pass my intent down to my direct reports. They take that intent, they turn it into a plan. That becomes their plan and their tasks. They then turn around and delegate those tasks down to the next level. And so my intent becomes their tasks becomes the next level's down's intent, and then they turn into their tasks, and then their tasks become the next level down's intent, and so forth. This is this cascading thing. And then, of course, you have the back briefing coming back up through the model. So what's a back brief? The back brief is where your team is basically passing back up, and this is an actual diagram from an actual commander's intent manual showing the different pieces. And of course, the goal of this is to ensure that alignment, to ensure that everyone really understands their mission and understands their intent, they're clear about it, and so forth. And this is the part that, frankly, I often neglect. I know this is it's the easy part to neglect. It's easy to say, all right, everyone's got their mission, go. Everyone go do your work. And not to actually have people check in with you. And if they don't check in with you and say, here's what I think I heard, and here's how I'm actually going to go and pull it off, then you're going to be surprised a week later when they come back with totally doesn't match at all your intent because your orders were not very clear and you screwed it up. So here are some examples of actual commander's intents from actual military briefings. These are a little bit hard to parse if you're not necessarily in the military, but there's, and actually I've got my colleague here, Tom today, who's in the military himself. Tom, can you actually parse for me UNMIH? I'm assuming that's United Nations, yeah. Yeah, so, in this particular intent, it's to secure and stabilize the environment so the government can maintain functional governments and so forth, right? To basically stabilize the government. Another one, divest the zone of their operation support. I think this is, yeah, I'm not going to go into the details of these. You can get to some examples. We pulled this off the internet. But this is basically what an actual intent looks like. It's setting out the outcome that you want to accomplish for your organization. Now, one thing that's interesting is oftentimes corporate mission statements themselves are kind of like a commander's intent for the entire organization. So if you look, for example, at the famous mission statement from Southwest Airlines, we are the low-cost airline. That is, in some ways, enough intent to help your whole organization understand what they need to be doing. A good intent inspires people. A good intent, when you hear the intent, if it's a good one, if you've got a good mission kind of briefing, you should immediately light up with ideas about how you're actually going to accomplish it. Right? That's an example of a really good one. In fact, I've got some tips here. So the first one is you can't have so much detail that the minute that someone starts to actually carry it out, the environment changes enough that it's no longer relevant. Then you basically did not, you failed. You did not, if you're going to communicate that much detail, it's no longer an intent, now it's an actual plan. And the goal is not to communicate a plan. That's one of the reasons why people always say a great corporate mission statement will live forever. Doesn't matter how the market might change, it should still be relevant 100 years after you give it out. Another one is a good one will align everyone's behaviors without requiring those very detailed micromanaging instructions. That's the whole point of it, right? Because again, it empowers people. Because if your team knows exactly what you want, they should feel free to improvise because they know exactly what those boundaries are. It's like a minefield. If I told you there's 1,000 mines buried out in that hallway out there, but I'm not going to tell you where they are, you're not going to leave this room because you're like, fuck, I leave this room, I'm going to blow up. But if every one of those mines has a big red flag over it, you know exactly where they are, you can go out and happily walk around the mines, no fear of being blown up. It's the same thing. If I give you a really good commander's intent and I tell you exactly what I want you to do in terms of the goal, you're free to go and improvise because now you know, okay, I know what I'm supposed to be doing. I know what my goals are and I know what my intent is and I can go figure out for myself how to accomplish it and I can move quickly. And as things change, I hire a supplier, the supplier flakes out, I can hire another supplier because that's all within my purview. If I as a boss said, you must use this supplier, and then the supplier turns out to be a flake, and I'm like, fuck, now what do I do? I was told to use a supplier and they're a flake, and now do I keep using them even though they're doing a terrible job? Do I have to go back to my boss, but he's on a vacation, he's on a business trip right now, I can't get a hold of him. I have to wait 2 weeks for him to come back before I can pick a new supplier. That's where you get into trouble. So the goal is to identify the mind so people can move more quickly. And again, a good one, if you hear a good one, it should immediately give you ideas of how to actually pull it off. So keep it short, to the point, enough information. There's this there's a military acronym called METT-T. Military loves acronyms. I believe it stands for Mission, Enemy, Troops, and Time Available. And it's sort of like an acronym to help a commander create a briefing by asking themselves, okay, what's the mission? Who's the enemy? What troops do I have available? And how much time do I have available? And it basically comes down to what are my resources? What are the competitors out there? Like what are the competing forces that might screw me up? And how much time do I have? So when you're thinking about giving a commander's intent or a briefing to your team, it's very helpful. It's not enough to just say, I want you to go and come up with a design for the next game. The intent might be, we need a design for the next game. Go build me a design. That's not actually enough. You also have to be specified. Who's the competition? I.e. what's the environment, landscape, terrain, basically what's the environment in which you need to build this thing. How many resources do you have? What's your budget? How many people can you work with? Can you draft the entire team to help you, or do you only have access to a few designers? And how much time available? I need this by next week, or I need this by a month from now. And until you've specified all these factors, the team can't really go and carry it out. So if you think about this kind of template then, and we've translated this a little bit now into kind of business speak, you've got this notion of the context, so what's the situation? The higher intent, so this is where you've got a multiple team. When you've got multiple levels, you've got to think about not just what I'm communicating as the intent down, but what intent was I given from above. So I'm CEO of a company, but I've got shareholders, and I've got investors, and I've got a board. And so I'm not entirely free to make up my intent myself. I've got to think about what my board's intent is coming down to me. So everyone is within some sort of structure. So you've got what's my higher intent, what's my intent, what do I actually want to get done, how do I know if I'm being successful, like what's the measure, what's that outcome look like, what's success look like, and then what are those boundaries, what are those freedoms and constraints. So with that, we're going to do a little workshop exercise. My colleague Tom here has got some worksheets we're going to pass around. We should have enough for everyone. So let's get these going, and then if we need to, you can just grab a sheet of paper and follow along. But the basic idea is every one of us is going to think about a problem we have at work, something that's on our minds. We're all executives. It should be no problem for us to come up with a half a dozen issues that are on our minds or problems we've got. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple different things. We're first going to think about what is the most important thing that we want to get done. Like what is that? What is our intent? What is the thing we want to accomplish? And we're going to specifically complete these sentences. We're going to say, if we do nothing else, and here we're talking about tomorrow's mission, but talk about it maybe in the context of the next sprint, let's say. If we do nothing else during this next period of time, except this one thing, we must blank. What is that blank? And then the single most important thing we must do is blank. And so essentially, one's kind of a little more the goal, one's a little more the tactic we're going to actually accomplish. And you don't want it to be fuzzy or distracted. You want to focus on what's the single most important thing. And then we're going to talk, and then I'm actually bring up the actual worksheet myself. And then we're going to talk about, and then we're going to start going through, and we're going to start characterizing the actual parameters. We're going to start characterizing how much time we have, what the resources we have, and so forth. So does everyone have one of these sheets? And then we're also going to do a little bit of sharing. So Tom, let me grab one of those myself. So who's brave? Who wants to raise their hand and suggest a problem that they're thinking about at work right now? I've got one if I have to, but I want to try to get some. Right there.
We need a new tool to determine loading times for the project.
Perfect. So your loading times are maybe slower than you want them to be, and you want to measure them, or you just want to know what they are.
Track trends.
What's that?
Track trends.
Sure.
Feature or asset.
Perfect. Okay, so you need a way to measure loading times for your game so you can see the impact on loading time as you add new things to the game. All right. So what is your intent to your team? What is the intent for this thing?
Have a way to determine and track loading times.
Sure. I want a way to determine loading times for the game. That's my intent. I want a way to. So what does success look like? Describe for us when this thing is done, the success looks like.
Easy to use tool as in load times, decent enough
Sure. So that's the outcome. That's the success. So in terms of setting up your team, what's if you do nothing else tomorrow? What's the one thing you would? Sorry, Tom. Oh, yeah. Thanks. It's my own staff meeting. Let's go back over to here. Yeah. So if you're going to do nothing else tomorrow, what would be the one thing you're going to get done in this thing?
If I hadn't already done it, have a layout of what is it actually going to be like. Here's the interface, and here are the steps it's going to need to take to do the things it needs to do.
Okay. So let's flip the backside then. So this is a perfect example of the kind of intent you're going to communicate to your team. Let's get a couple more before we go into the next stage. Who else wants to raise their hand and share an example of a project they've got and an intent they want to share? Well, I'll give one for my own example right now. So I'm in the process of raising my next round of financing for my company. So we're raising our Series B. And so I've been kind of sharing with my team that my intent is we need to create a Series B pitch deck. So we're working on a pitch deck that we can basically take to our investors. And so my intent is a pitch deck that when I show it to an investor, they will beg to give me their money, is basically my outcome. And that's sort of my next thing. So in terms of my team, there's one thing we do next week. It's create that draft of that pitch deck and actually get something that we can start looking at as a group. Anyone else want to share anything? Okay. So let's look at the back now. So the next step then is start thinking about some of the other factors. And obviously these are not all going to apply to every problem, right? So in the case of competition, for example, in your case, I don't know the competition necessarily applies unless you have a thought on that.
Like the tool to be in-house and not some third party.
Okay, so you want to have it in-house and not third party so that you're presumably not paying licensing fees or otherwise you want to have control over it. Sure. And right, external forces, what might affect your mission for your team, external forces, what are some things that might happen external to your group that might affect it? This might be internal, it doesn't have to be a competitor, it could be an internal group within your own company.
Getting different testers on projects that may have other priorities what they would like to have. Other tools and their development, the maintenance of currently available tools.
Sure, your engineers might get pulled off the project. You might, your team might lose the resources you have for this thing. And then in terms of resources, so in terms of delegating to whoever you're delegating to, what resources are they going to have available to do this?
Going to need some time from testers for the engineers to take a look with their examples to those testers, see if it works for them. Other than that, minor database and Visual Studio.
Yeah, perfect. So yeah, so you've got your engineers worked out, you've got your database set up, you've got your pieces in place for that. And then time. What's the constraints? How much time are you giving your team to pull this off? Do you need it tomorrow, next week, a month from now?
Probably could be done in a week.
Okay.
And that's with thorough testing, both with user experience and just data collection.
And do you actually have in your head the people you're going to be delegating this to? Do you actually know who exactly this is going to? Yeah. Yeah.
Because they've proven themselves in the past, and also some of them are the only people for the job.
Right. Now, I know this is a hypothetical example. Have you actually already queued these people up and spun them off on this?
Yes.
And so did you go through a backbrief process? Did you actually have a chance for them to kind of come back to you and say, hey, okay, great, here's how I'm going to go through this. Here's my plan for how we're going to pull this off?
Yes. Getting feedback from testers, and then putting together a plan, bringing that back to testers, they giving feedback on that, creating a cycle.
Cool. And when you first heard that plan back from your team, like, okay, great, here's how we're going to do this, was it exactly what you wanted, or did you have to kind of course-correct them a little bit and say, okay, well, this is pretty good, but we need to make a couple other tweaks to it?
Needed to make a few other tweaks, but because of that, having a particular insight, they were more than happy that it would be able to be added.
Yeah. So anyway, that's great. So it sounds like you found a great process. And again, it is common sense, right? It is common sense to sort of define what you want, make sure you know what the resources are, hand it off, get the feedback on how you're going to pull it off, and then iterate. It can work for something as small as a tool, for a Series B deck, for an entire corporate mission statement. Other people want to share thoughts on this? Otherwise, because we have a lot of time, this is really meant to be, take the time to actually do this. I mean, I encourage people don't, how to put this. I don't know about you, but if you look at, you just saw my calendar on the wall there for a second, but like it's pretty busy, right? We all have these crazy back-to-back meetings. I don't know, this is my day yesterday, right? That's kind of what it looks like. So when you're that busy, you rarely have time to actually think about this stuff. And I don't know about you, but one of the great definitions I heard for an executive is, in theory, you're only doing three things. You're thinking, you're communicating, and you're thinking, you're communicating, and I was going to say do email, but what's that? No, but basically, it's I'm sorry, deciding. Thinking, deciding, and communicating are really the only three things executives should be doing, ideally. Obviously, we're all small companies. We're all getting a lot more than just that. But we rarely have enough time to think. I think typically we spend too much time in the tactics, not enough in the big picture. And so I think the goal of and the reason I found this so powerful is it gives me that opportunity to really step back and say, what's the most important thing, and what do I want to have happen, and then communicate that and let your people, take it and run with it. And okay. Well, basically, we're done. So unless people have other questions, or want to just let's see if there's any questions about the material before we wrap up. Yeah, Reese. Hey, man.
What was the book that you mentioned up front? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, it's called The Art of Action, and I highly recommend it. I mean, my talk was essentially a 25-minute summary of a pretty decent book. It's a lot more material, but he basically goes through the theory that I've already outlined, the theory of friction, and why this even, where this kind of came from, and then it goes through a lot of detail on how to actually apply it. There's a lot of material I left out on the actual mechanics of implementing in a typical organization, but it's a great book. Yeah, question?
Have you ever come across an abridged version of On War?
I have not. I know they're out there. I did a little bit of research online last night. It's a daunting book. Yeah. But I will say this: so this book, actually, I take it back. This book itself has one of the first chapters is a pretty good summary, actually, of On War and why Clausewitz was so important, but also why many people have such trouble with it, because it's pretty dense. Other questions? No. So given that, since we did end up early, take this time to actually, don't just run out there and grab a coffee. Take this time to actually, spend 10 minutes thinking, well, what do I want to get done next? And what is the most important thing for my organization? And have I sufficiently communicated that to my team? And if not, why not? And take this back with you. There's plenty of resources like this online. If you're interested, fill it out. And I encourage you to share this with your team. This kind of thing works best when you actually roll it out throughout an entire organization. Because going back to that, that cascading model for a second here. It works best when everyone is basically following the process all the way down, because then there we go. Because then you actually have the common language, so that I'm communicating my intent to my direct reports. They in turn are communicating their intent to their direct reports, and so on down the chain. And then it gives everyone in the organization a common vocabulary to use. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.